Well, Egypt's an example. I mean, what kind of democracy can you have when you take a poll among the Egyptians and find out that 75% of the Egyptians believe that women who commit adultery should be stoned to death, but not men? I mean, this actually happened, folks. Or that persons who steal should have their hands cut off, and that persons who convert from Islam should be executed. I mean, this was an official poll. About 80% of the people believe that persons who convert from Islam to any other religion should be executed. That Sharia law, this is Sharia law, should be strictly enforced, and that everybody should obey, that the younger brothers should obey the older brothers, and the wives are property of the husbands, and the wives should obey the husbands without question. Husbands can divorce their wives, but wives cannot divorce their husbands. Again, what kind of democracy are they going to be able to put together? But that's a question that has not been answered. All right. Again, what I'm talking about is very relevant to modern times. If any of you have any opinions, any ideas, your inputs, your thoughts are welcome. These issues are still going on, except the one difference is Israel does have a homeland in what was Palestine, and the Palestinians still hate them. Now, your book talks about nationalism, revolution. The main thing I want you to get out of this section is the East, the eastern part of Asia, began to lean strongly towards communism. And that was especially true in China, and became true later in Vietnam. I believe I've already mentioned how that when Woodrow Wilson was in Paris in 1919, some Vietnamese bellboy came up to him and tried to convince Mr. Wilson to listen to him, and Mr. Wilson brushed him aside. This Vietnamese bellboy turned out to be Ho Chi Minh. And my generation suffered terribly for that brush aside, because 50,000 young men about my age died in the Vietnam War trying to keep Vietnam from going communist. Anyway, Ho Chi Minh, or this Vietnamese bellboy, said, well, if Wilson won't listen to me, I'll go talk to Lenin. He became close friends with Lenin and later Stalin, and later Khrushchev. And he was encouraged by the Chinese also to rebel. But anyway, now, in the land of China, big country of China, I mentioned last time we visited China how that Sun Yat-sen had set up a republic, but he was ousted quickly. Eventually, Chiang Kai-shek took over. But he was opposed by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, a communist. Now, eventually, in the long run, in 1949, Mao was to win. But for the time being, Chiang was able to keep Mao in check. Mao had to endure a whole lot of hardness. But essentially, it appears that Mao presented a better case to Chinese poor than Chiang did. But these two men fought and fought. Eventually, they stopped their fighting to fight off the Japanese. And when they fought off the Japanese, they resumed their fighting among themselves again. Again, China was destined to become a communist country. Your book talks about the appeal of communism. One of the things that made communists appeal to both China and Vietnam, China had conquered Vietnam and held it for 1,000 years and almost forced Confucianism onto the Vietnamese. And then when China began to fall apart and Vietnam got conquered, both the Chinese and Vietnamese blamed Confucius, or Confucian doctrine, on their failure to keep themselves from being conquered. And as China became in worse and worse shape, the people in China became disillusioned with Confucius. And they began to think that, hey, what we need is a new ideology. And the ideology they wound up accepting was communism. Your book mentions Ho Chi Minh here. He went to Moscow, and I mentioned how he became friends with Lenin and Stalin and was trained in revolutionary tactics. And then went back to Vietnam and encouraged the Vietnamese to rebel against the French. All right. Again, China was torn back and forth between communism on the one side. Well, actually, we're being torn into three parts. The Japanese on the one hand, the communists on the other, and the nationalists on the other. The nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. All right, so what happened? Well, eventually the Japanese took a hand, and they began to take over Korea, then Manchuria. Manchuria, that country just north of Korea, or the part of China north of Korea. And they began to make some serious inroads into China, which all told made the Chinese people more suspicious of their own government and more convinced that communism could solve their problems. Eventually, the communists, the nationalists made an attempt to unite. And for a few years, about 3 years, they were united. Chiang Kai-shek took over the Nationalist Party, and he was able to drive out Mao for a while. Your book shows a picture of Mao Zedong making what's called the Long March. Mao initially lost, but he didn't give up. He initially lost and was forced to flee, you might say, to the Chinese wilderness as Chiang Kai-shek took over. But Chiang Kai-shek was weakened by corruption and weakened by the incursion of the Japanese, who had some serious designs on China. There was a lot of attempts to move China toward Western ideology, Western democracy. Again, folk, it's not that I like what I'm saying, but when I was in high school, we discussed this. There are some nations or some people who just simply do not seem to be cut out for Western-style democracy, and Far Eastern people are among them. That includes the Chinese, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, and the Indonesians. Most of your Far Eastern people, the Asiatic people, just simply cannot make democracy work. China was such a nation. China found itself torn between the West on the one hand, the United States tugging at it, and the East on the other, or communism tugging and pulling at it. Then came the Great Depression of the 30s. And the Great Depression greatly undermined the Chinese confidence in capitalism and Western democracy. The Chinese felt like, hey, if Western democracy is so great, how come their own people are standing in bread lines? And they felt the same about European. How come European currency has failed? How come Europeans are impoverished? And how come half of European men are unemployed? And they began to doubt Western ideologies. with the results that they began to lean more and more towards communism. I want to jump ahead in the story a little bit. I mean, all right, granted, China eventually embraced communism, and what happened? They were worse off under communism than they had been under Chiang Kai-shek. We'll talk a little bit about what happened, but communism took over in 1949. Within about 10 years, more than 25 million Chinese had died of starvation. They were far worse off than they had been under Chiang Kai-shek. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. The old family traditions began to break down. The younger people began to have more freedom in choosing a husband or wife or marriage partner. Free choice in marriage, more relaxed attitudes towards sex became commonplace among the rich. But a lot of the Chinese did not feel the change, not yet. Your book shows someone, that little vignette there on page 713, and you might can tell this woman that's pictured on page 713 has had her feet bind. She has very small feet, which basically means she's a crippled woman. And the issue is women and women's rights. And again, another vignette on page 714 tells a story about a young Chinese man. He was from a moderately wealthy family. He had dreams. I mean, in his dream, he was going to go to Europe and study chemistry and come back and be a chemist and change his people to more modern ways. But again, he needed this degree from a European university to do this. He also had in mind the girl he wanted to marry, but his father became sick. His father called him in. He was the oldest son. He said, "Son, I'm going to turn over the farm to you, and you must manage the farm. And also, I know you need a wife, so I picked a woman for you." And he named her, which was not the woman he wanted to marry. And the poor man, after listening to his father for about an hour, talk about his father's plans and knew his father was dying, he went to his room and just cried and cried and cried because all the dreams he'd had, he would not get to live out. The door was closed to him. And he buried his head beneath his bedding so no one knew he was crying. He never thought of resisting, never even fought back. All he did was bemoan his fate, accepted it, and completely complied with his father's will. Married the girl his father told him to. Took over his father's estate like his father told him to, and lived and died, not living the life that he himself wanted to live. Again, a lot of this still goes on in the world today. All right. Japan. As I've already mentioned, Japan has had a difficult time becoming democratic. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. After World War II, when the United States conquered, the United States somewhat forced democracy on them, but they never really became truly democratic. They set up what looked like the democracy on paper, but in actuality, it was control. In fact, one party was to run Japanese politics for 50 years, which should tell you, hey, they did not really have a true democracy, because one party in a true democracy cannot hold on to power for 50 years, because a democracy usually has two political parties that are nearly equal, and as the fortunes of the economy go back and forth, or the fortunes of the society go back and forth, the one party becomes stronger, then that party falls out of favor, and the other party comes up. But Japan only had one party for a good many years. But anyway, they made a pretense to be democratic because they were trying to copy the West. If you turn to page 717, you'll see what looks like a war-torn city. In actual reality, yeah, it looks like, I mean, the destruction is very terrible, but they had a tremendous earthquake in 1923, September 23rd. I mean, these Japanese were, I mean, well, the last earthquake in Japan, the big earthquake, occurred 3 years ago this month. Is that right? 2011, I believe, 3 years ago. Well, they had a 30-second warning. I mean, they now have ways you can get a few seconds warning so that people realize the alarms are going off. Oops, an earthquake is coming. Let's get out of the building and head out in the open. But in 1923, there was no such warning. Nobody predicted. And all of a sudden, the earthquake came and killed them by the thousands in the city of Tokyo. The Japanese, being the resilient people they are, they quickly rebuilt the city, only to have it destroyed again by American bombers in World War II. The wealth of Japan found its way into the hands of only a few who became very, very wealthy. Your average Japanese remained impoverished. Now, the Japanese did try to industrialize, and they got a lot of help from their women, without which the industrialization might have been more difficult. But the women learned how to work along beside their husbands or work along beside the men in the factories. And they created Japan into an industrial society. But Japan did struggle between conflicting ideologies, but what tilted the favor in favor of the nationalists or the warlords was the Great Depression that occurred in 1929, and as was in the case of Germany and Italy and Spain, and to some extent the United States and Britain and France. When the Depression came, you might say the bad guys moved in. Now, I'm going to call them bad in the case of the Japanese and Italians and the Germans. I'm not going to class Franco of Spain as a bad man, or Roosevelt of the United States as a bad man, but the bad guys tended to move in and take advantage of the situation to control. In the case of the Japanese, it was the warlords who, thanks to the Depression, were able to manipulate and nose out all opposition and take over and more or less run the country their way.